So we're talking about enhancing outcomes in a more person-centered, inclusive way. And the goals that we identified for this in particular are listed on that discussion guide: improve representation, improve community involvement, engagement, transparency, user-friendliness, demonstrating trustworthiness, and engaging and preparing a diverse workforce. So the first question that we're asked to identify here is, do you agree with these goals? The planning committee sat around and talked about these, but we're a fairly limited number of people. So do you agree with the ones that I just stated that are listed in the discussion guide, or would you change them, modify them, add to them? That's the first question.
Having been part of the planning committee, I agree.
Yeah, this is, my name is Kevin Fowler. I would just say, yeah, I agree with these, but these been out there a while. And I guess my question is how much progress has been made. So I think that's probably where my maybe frustration is that these issues have been identified some time ago, but I don't know if we're really making progress. So anyway, that's my 2 cents.
Well, if you could, I'll try to stimulate conversation here. If you could identify one that we're doing the worst at on this list, what would it be?
I would just say, community involvement, just in terms of making sure that the people who benefit the most from treatment are represented in clinical trials. And so I would say specifically community outreach.
Mm-hmm.
That'd be my suggestion.
Okay. Other thoughts?
This is Keith Ferdinand from New Orleans. I agree with that. The Moderna virus vaccine, when it first started, was only 1-2% African Americans, and they were happily moving along until the summertime when it was brought to the attention of the Institute. They then made a very specific effort and were able to finally reach 10% participation, but that wasn't initially part of the process of enrolling people in the trials. Not that you would think that the vaccine would be different across race, ethnicities, but it would be a barrier for uptake when patients will look at the population and say, I don't see anybody that looks like me in the study.
Yeah. So I wasn't involved with Moderna, but why do you think that is? Why do you think a company approaches it without prioritizing?
I mean, this is just to kind of build upon what Dr. Ferdinand said. This is what my experience has been, is that, I mean, so much just goes back to the basics, right? Relationships. And people don't take time to build relationships in these communities. They're like, okay, we need something right now, so let's go out there. I just think a lack of foresight in investing in communities and building relationships and having trust. I mean, it's not that hard, but I think there's a lot of talk around it, but there's not a lot of foresight and investment. That's my opinion working with clinical trials.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, I would totally agree with that. I didn't mean to cut you off, Dr. Drazen. Please go ahead.
Okay, Rick, go ahead.
I agree that we need to have a community-based infrastructure, even something that is sustainable, something that is invested in, and something that is staffed by a diverse set of investigators who look like and can relate easily to the community that it serves, and that can therefore build trust over time. To me, this kind of infrastructure is really lacking and needs that kind of investment in order to get there. I think the other thing that we've sort of suffered from, having spent many years in industry running clinical trials, is that the first thing that you're trying to do is get your trial up, running as fast as you can, enrolling as quick as you can, going to the same centers over and over if you can, because they're going to do a good job. And I think a watershed event is at Pharma, we've now put out new principles for all of our member companies to increase clinical trial diversity. And those principles are really saying, no, wait. As you design your clinical trial, as you start to set up your sites, you need to set this as a real goal. And you need to do these various different approaches. Now, that's not going to work by itself if we don't have the community engagement. So it's really going to take a concerted and direct effort from those who are designing and implementing the trials, but it's also going to take the community involvement and the building of trust. No question.
So, Rich, these are pharma principles. Why aren't companies following them, and what can we do to improve that?
I can tell you. I'll tell you from. Hey, but go ahead. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Rich, first,
I'd
and
like
then Kevin. Yeah.
I'd like to listen to others.
No, this is my point of view. I worked in pharma, and now I work for myself, right? And so I work with pharma companies, and I don't want to. And sometimes it's difficult for pharma companies to say, but I think part of it is the CRO models, right? They're kind of outdated, right? They're operated on a very old paradigm. They're not really relationship based. So I think, in my opinion, I think some of these CROs are very outdated. And I'll just say this too, is that I think that there's a danger when you keep saying people like, look like me, but I think what Dr. Willis said is that for us, we need to also understand the issues. We need to learn. So I just say that, but I think the CROs are a outdated model, in my humble opinion.
Yeah. Yeah. Sorry, let me just interrupt 1 second. Is there anybody wants to volunteer to be the report out? Mark, you brought it up. Are you willing? Okay. Can we hear you? Better say something. Make sure your sound's working.
I was afraid of that. Sure.
Okay, well, you stepped into it, so thank you. We'll help you. All right, who was trying to say something? Andrew?
Hi, Carlin Schrader. I have a different perspective. I'm with a patient group, the Parkinson's Foundation. And so while I'm coming from that different perspective, I am in agreement with the things that have just been said. So I just wanted to put a fine point on the importance of partnerships between industry and patient groups for reaching communities. We're working with an industry sponsor right now who's supporting our work in Hispanic communities. While we all want to eventually enroll these communities in a shared trial goal that we have, some sponsored by industry, some sponsored by us, we have a joint understanding that we need to spend time and money creating trust in the communities, building partnerships, and building community leaders, in this case, promotores. So I just want to kind of put a fine point on that idea of building the community that we need of trusted leaders. If we are allies to the community, doing the learning that we need to do, and ensuring we're investing time and money up front, so we're not racing against that first patient, first visit deadline. We're doing the prep, in this case, years in advance of when we actually need to recruit communities to research.
Yeah. Go ahead, Erica.
Yeah, I'm Erica Brown, and I'm like Carlin, a patient advocate. I'm a patient community builder. I created a really unique community called Colon Town that really I'm in the cancer world. I'm about to launch another much larger endeavor, creating a bigger footprint for the patient communities. I heard what our welcomer, Pastor King, I think, said, and basically what he was saying was, go where we are. And if the CROs are an impediment, which I tend to agree with, I want to encourage and encourage that statement that I think that's kind of true, that the CROs do get in the middle. I have a very practical thing to suggest, and that is hire patients to be the communicators to the patient communities. We're the ones that have the credibility and the trust. And I see industry over the years and never backing back from. They can't, for whatever reason, seem to hire the patients to be the patient advocacy communicators. And we're available. And we, for the most part, after we come through our experience, really want to help, because we have that pay it forward mentality. And we also have the mentality of wanting to learn more about what's going on to protect ourselves. So that's my input.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I mean, one thing about the point about the CROs, of course, CROs don't do this on their own. CROs work for somebody. They work for academic researchers. They work for companies. They do what they're told, what's in their contract. So they could be trying to lead this, but I think the role of the people funding and managing trials at the highest level really bear the most responsibility for this. Any other comments on that?
Oh, I think the problem
yeah.
that we're, the whole enterprise is set up on a piecework basis. That you're doing a trial and it's over, and then it sort of everything disappears. And since patients are the ones putting themselves at risk, there needs to be a way to build confidence in the entire clinical trials format for that particular condition before people are willing to put themselves at risk. And people have different risk tolerances. And one of the real problems, of course, is that when we're working with a defined disease that's relatively uncommon, people have begun to band themselves together. When we're working with something that's relatively common, as COVID-19 is, we don't have patient advocacy groups for them, but we need to have somebody in our community who we already trust. When I do a clinical trial, I can read a patient or talk to a patient, this long form, and at the end of it, they look you in the eye and say, "Doc, should I do this?"
Yeah.
Because they have trust in you as their doctor. And so we need to make sure that the people in the community are part of the clinical trial operation, not and what I mean by the people in the community, the healthcare providers in that community. And that means we have to spend money on it because quite often we're trying to do this for free, and time is money, especially to healthcare professionals.
Yep.
And so that we can't say, well, wait until we need the group to build it. You don't wait until you need an army to recruit. You have a standing army, and to be honest, we're an army fighting a disease, and we need to figure out a way to enroll people broadly across the population so that when we need them, they can be mobilized.
Yeah. Andrea?
Steve, I just want to give you compliment you. You recognize that at the end of the day, here I was blaming the CROs, but really it's the pharma companies have to accept the responsibility, right? Right. So that I think that,
Sure.
but I think that I it's kind of like a broken record over and over. What are clinical trials about? As the gentleman just mentioned, it's all about trust, right? And if you think about how people are treated in clinical trials, I mean, let's be honest about it. They're not really recognized. And then if you take a look at that in other communities, African-American communities, times it by 10 how badly it is, right? Mm-hmm. So I think a lot of this is not really groundbreaking. It's just a question of a commitment to do it.
Yeah, yeah.
And
Patty, Andrea?
And the acknowledgement that maybe it hasn't been done well. That would go a long way.
So this is Daniel. I just had 2 points. One is, I see.
Wait, please. We got. Let me try to go in line. Raise your hand if you want to talk. We got Andrew first, and then Patty.
I tried to see if there was a little raise your hand button on here that I could find other than just doing it physically.
I'm watching. I see.
Thanks. This is an interesting group to be a part of. I do a little bit in pharma clinical trials, but very little. I do mostly community engaged research and have a lot of experience doing clinical trials using CBPR approaches. And so I just want to comment a little bit. We have trials where we have 80-90% of our participants are African-American. Right now we have a hypertension trial going where we have 1,500 African-American patients with uncontrolled hypertension. And my experience has been that they're not, a lot of times in these communities, sometimes people aren't necessarily unwilling to participate. It's just they're not asked. And so as I watch this and I look at these goals and I understand that maybe they're coming out of industry, I'm curious about where these goals fit within the broader goals coming out of industry. Are these at the top of the goals, or are these sort of sandwiched somewhere in the middle? Because I don't feel like these goals are the ones that are prioritized. And so, I would just say that in the trials that I'm running right now, most of the patients or participants that we have included would be excluded from most of the trials that I've ever been a part of. And so I feel like there's a little bit of a tension between clinical trials that are maybe more focused on efficacy and expediency, versus looking at sort of effectiveness and pragmatism and how effective are they for various communities. So I don't know how you get around trying to prove efficacy at the very beginning, but I think we have to have a broader view of how we include patients without drawing lines about, this person's not going to show up, they're not adherent, they're not going to do this, they're not going to do that, and then they're out.
Right.
And then before we know it, we have a very limited pool of people to participate. And so I just think having more of an effectiveness, pragmatic view at the very beginning, I think that point has been a little bit raised already, but I guess I'd like to underline it.
Yeah.
Because I think people are willing, they just aren't always eligible.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks. Good point. Patty?
So just stressing what Andrea said, the community-based participatory research approach just has to become ordinary in research and clinical trial research, that everyone has to know what that is and start using that model. So I think just pure capacity building along those lines. And as part of that, I think that will quickly lead you to the reconstitution of what a clinical trial research team actually is, and having community scientists involved in that team. So it's not so much just prioritized on the clinical trial investigator themselves and then the other folks managing that, but really as, what the standard of excellence is for a clinical trial team is one that also includes community scientists, folks who can really help you with the engagement, and they're engaged on an ongoing basis with those communities. So they start to see that local community scientist as someone that, that's the clinical trial person. This is what the value of clinical trials is. This is what it means to our community and so on. But then I think just as another thing is just start to set the standard of excellence is clinical trials need to reflect the epidemiology and the disease burden that is out there. So as you do the trial, that's what's going to be the standard of excellence, because it then, there's the slow and fast arguments of slowing things down, which also carries a lot of prejudice in it anyway. But when do a lot of times has been slowing down after launch because of the adverse events in the population. And certainly my company has experienced that too. So this whole slow and fast thing has to be completely changed to, at the end of the day, what we're really trying to do is understand the effectiveness of the medicines, the appropriate use of them, so they can generate as much health once they're broadly available to the population.
Yeah, great, thanks. And I thank you for finding the hand raising, Daniel and Clay. So I think, Daniel, you're first, and then Clay. And I'm watching your faces, but feel free to use the hand raising if you want. Daniel, you there?
Great. Yes, I am. Thank you. I completely agree with all the points raised, and certainly I think two important aspects here. One is what our center is doing at the FDA Center for Devices and Radiological Health, and engagement with patients and caregivers, and to hear, understand, and integrate their perspectives into the design aspects and how the devices are evaluated. And there's also been a translation in that into the trials themselves, and really capturing evidence from clinical experience, and really the ability to embed these trials, these studies into the healthcare setting and as seamless of a fashion as possible, and really having that buy-in from the community. So, I think there was a question raised earlier on about what are we doing on those aspects. Certainly, we have worked as a center to address a portion of this, and engaging with the community now to really figure out that evidence from clinical experience, leveraging healthcare system information, working with the National Evaluation System for Health Technologies and others to really kind of harness the power of real world evidence and have this more seamless integration of trials.
Good, thanks. Clay?
Yeah, I think this is a really, really important conversation, and I'm glad we're having it. But I do want to underline something that Kevin said very early. We're having it again, right? So if you've been in these conversations for a while, then this is familiar. It becomes sort of trendy for a while, and then we forget about it, and then it comes, I don't think we've solved this. And I don't think that just fixing some aspect of the clinical trial, the way that we do it, is going to solve it either. I think that the reality is that the finances push in the opposite direction. A company looks at this and they're like, you're doing a vaccine trial. You want to get that trial done as quickly as you possibly can with sites that using the systems that are fully baked. And in that goes against focusing on the diversity and having it match the population that is affected by the disease. It goes against adding more community engagement, all those things, at least until there's a foundation built around that. So I think we have to think structurally about how to change the incentives. So I think one way is to one way to do it is to actually to demonstrate that we care by focusing on diseases that are disproportionately affecting communities of color. And I think there is an interest in doing that. I think it'd be really exciting to have a whole portfolio where we know these are conditions that are dominated by communities of color. We're going to prioritize those. The other would be to somehow allow gatekeeping for approvals that require some reasonable representation by gender, race, ethnicity. I think everybody's afraid of that, but the reality is we do that to some extent for gender. So why don't we do that for race, ethnicity? Would we be willing to accept that? I don't think, the label would be the other. I don't think label, limiting label based on representation is a good idea. I think that ultimately hurts the populations we want to help. So I don't think that would work. But thinking more broadly about how do we get these incentives right? And then if the incentives are right, all the entities that are represented on in this call are good at aligning the systems to meet in particular, financial incentives.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but I wanted to give you a 4-minute warning.
Okay, great, thanks. The next question, we've covered this somewhat already, but we wanted to get suggestions for interim actions, both short-term actions and then milestones in the next 5 years up to 2025, and then farther by 2020. So granular, what can we do next? We've heard some of those suggestions already, but as specific as you can be, for the companies, for CROs, others, what would you do next? And Rich, I see your hand, so go ahead.
Well, I've said before, we think establishing principles for inclusion are really important and not quotas. Really working from the right commitment and frame of mind is a key step in getting people to actually honor those commitments as they move forward. And whether it's public shaming or whatever we do, that to make sure that we move forward on that front. But I still think we need to build a sustainable community-based clinical research network that utilizes the people in the community in all the ways that we've heard from people speaking here and from Dr. King as well. That requires funding to really keep it going, just as Dr. King suggested. And it requires training. But I think if we can build a network like that in a sustainable way that companies can go to, that academics can work with, and build that trust and base, and not this piecemeal approach that Dr. Drazen pointed out.
So who should do that, Rich? Who, to be very specific, who should do that?
I think it should be a public-private partnership. I think it's something that companies are willing to do. We've discussed it a lot at pharma. Mm-hmm. I think it's something that groups like the NIH can do, join in. I think academic centers can join in this. I think patient and community organizations can join in this. I think it requires a coming together that can really achieve this. Obviously,
on the public side, who should be the public? Which part of the government?
Ideally, I think it would be NIH.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Other thoughts on that? I think we're almost out of time. Yeah,
just
go ahead.
one.
Kevin and Erica. Yeah.
There was one, I apologize, a person talked about the importance of epidemiology driving enrollment, right? And so I would just theory that I have the professional interest said personal interest is kidney disease, right? So there's a classic example. There's all these clinical trials that could change the course of life for people with kidney disease, especially African Americans. 36% of people on dialysis are African American. There's a classic example where these clinical trials could change their lives. And it's really putting a challenge to the community, those companies, to ensure the clinical trials represent the people that are impacted by disease. And I don't see that happening right now, quite frankly.
Yeah, yeah.
That is part of the principles that we put forward, exactly that.
Yeah. Who was the other hand up on this? Yeah, sorry, Erica, go ahead.
Yeah, it was just me. I just want to refer us back to what Dr. King said. And basically what he was issuing was a call to the commitment to service from each of us. And that's where it all starts, guys, is just that attitude of service to others. And that's how you get to reaching people where they are. So as you're talking about all the institutional stuff and money, incentives and everything, think in terms of one-to-one people, and you'll get closer to what everybody's looking for, which is relationship building, which has been touched upon. It's really, really important.
Yep, thanks. Amir?
Yeah, so just to add something that we haven't talked about, I think this is all about incentives. Just like Kevin said, we've been talking about this long enough. One part that I think could be really put up as a straw man is to provide patent exclusivity, to really incentivize what we're talking about today. If you just provide a 6 months exclusivity for any indication that comes through, all of a sudden this will be fixed. I don't care what benchmark you put up. So let's think outside the box a little bit too. I mean, regulatory is one thing, exclusivity is another, and then along the line of what Rich said, I think NIH is really nicely positioned to work in partnership with industry to provide additional funding as required.
Yep, yeah. Good. So Daniel, I don't know if your hand raises from before, and then Mark, you had your actual hand. So maybe Mark, you first, and then Daniel took his down.
I guess something that I think about a lot is the workforce and the challenges a workforce faces in these communities, and the training that they'll need to manage, people's ideas of risk and to kind of manage fake news, right?